Mike Adams.
Are you kidding me? Do you think that disease is a spontaneous, random chance? No, disease has a cause.
The Health Ranger Report.
If you don't believe in cause and effect, then you don't believe in reality. Every disease has a cause.
It's time for the Health Ranger Report. The Health Ranger Report. And now from naturalnews.com, here's Mike Adams.
There's such a big reckoning coming for our world where people are going to be just astonished to find out that things don't work the way they thought they did. Thank you for joining me. This is Mike Adams, the Health Ranger. You're listening to healthrangerreport.com. My website is naturalnews.com. And, I really strive to awaken people to what I see as the reality of what's coming. And what we know about human history is that communities and nations and civilizations move through eras of increasing delusion until it reaches a breaking point or a tipping point, and the delusion collapses back to reality, and then the reality happens for a little while, and then it leads its way to more delusion and more delusion until the delusion becomes so unbearably unsustainable that it collapses again. It's just a cycle. You might call it delusion bubbles. And delusion bubbles can exist in every area of society. You can have a science delusion bubble, which we have with the whole climate change hoax. It is a complete hoax. Real scientists all agree that humankind's activity on this planet is not the primary driver of changes in temperature, by the way. But that's for another discussion. You can have delusion bubbles in cryptocurrency, which is happening right now, where you've got Bitcoin and Ethereum and all these cryptocurrencies skyrocketing in perceived value as there's like a mad rush to get into them, to buy them. But it's just another kind of .com bubble variant, and it's going to correct in a big way in the future. Don't know exactly when, but that's just another kind of delusion bubble. There are delusion bubbles in terms of the sustainability of the food supply. People think food is always going to be available cheaply, that you can go to the grocery store and get food. And yet you've got pollinators collapsing. You've got soil collapsing, eroding, blowing away. You've got the mass chemical contamination of growing of farm soils and farmlands. You've got the total crash of ocean fisheries and aquatic ecosystems and so on. We're living through the mass crash of food production potential for our planet, and yet a lot of people don't realize that because, again, they're living in various delusions. And of course, we have the delusion of the central bank and the fiat currency money supply and the dollar, which will crash at some point. The dollar will be worthless, virtually worthless at some point, because like all fiat currencies, it crashes and burns because it's not backed by anything. So we've got all these delusions out there. There's a bond market bubble. There's a real estate bubble. There's a stock market bubble. Cryptocurrency bubble I already mentioned. All of these bubbles, the delusion even is extended into the world of medicine, where we're told that pharmaceutical medicine is the only medicine that works and that it's going to make you healthier. But it doesn't. And that delusion is collapsing as well. Every time these delusions crash, human civilization goes through a period of strife. There's a lot of conflict, typically. There's a reallocation of the distribution of wealth, or you might call it the confiscation of wealth. Every day of reckoning is a chaotic day for society because the old order often loses out as a new order enters the picture, or as assets or resources are recalibrated because the perceptions are recalibrated. Delusions can't happen unless people are seeing things as they are not, but they're believing in them based on false faith in broken systems. And when that human psyche is recalibrated to the new reality, when the stock market crashes, for example, it's a big wake-up call. People understand that, I guess there isn't a vehicle that can create wealth out of nothing forever. Eventually it comes to an end. So there's a recalibration. It's psychologically very disturbing to humanity. And it's this disturbing psychology that actually feeds into a lot of the, rioting or revolts or attempts to overthrow the government, or perhaps civil war, social unrest, lots of issues like that. And you're seeing a good example of that right now in Venezuela, where they're having a financial collapse due to bad socialist government. And they're on the verge of a total collapse and a complete revolution and starvation, actually, in Venezuela, which is, is the perfect example of why socialism doesn't work. Even though that country has lots of natural resources, including energy resources that should make the country wealthy, but instead it's on the verge of collapse and mass starvation. So prepare yourself for the psychology shift that's going to be very widespread and very chaotic and very dangerous in many ways. It's not the day of reckoning itself that is the risk or the issue. What causes the problems is the instability in the minds of the people. It's the mass fear. It's the collapse of their worldview model. It's these mental models that people hold on to that they think gives them certainty, or that they think is sustainability or predictability. And yet, when those mental models collapse because the evidence in the real world is so compelling that it cannot coexist with that mental model, you have a psychological implosion, a fracturing of the mind. You have a collapse, a cascading collapse of internal models, many of which are built upon each other, and belief systems start to shatter, which are like the pillars of a high-rise building, and then the building starts coming down floor by floor, like the World Trade Center. It's really that dramatic. The mental models inside people's minds can collapse like the World Trade Center. And it can happen from being struck by one airplane, or in their minds, one idea, one piece of evidence that cannot be refuted. One change in perception of what's happening in the real world is like that airplane hitting the World Trade Center buildings that can just collapse their entire mental model. And from that, they can become very destabilized and very fearful and sometimes desperate. And when large numbers of people suffer that kind of process, that's when nations collapse. That's when revolutions happen. That's when you had the breakup of the Soviet Union. That's when you have potentially in our future, in America's future, secession of states, maybe California, maybe Texas, the collapse of central control from the federal government, the balkanization of America. You have revolution happens when people's minds are heavily destabilized. So I want you to be prepared for that you are living in an era of, you're surrounded by people who are living false mental models. And those mental models will not last very long, because the evidence of collapse around them as it's happening will be so compelling that it can't coexist with those mental models for very long. So, falsehoods collapse and reality intrudes into the minds of people who would much rather continue to exist in their false realities. And they do not appreciate being shown the real world, and they do not appreciate anyone picking apart the falsehoods under which they are currently apparently thriving. And they will resist the destruction of their mental models. They would prefer to believe in the illusion and live in the illusion because it's more comforting and it's more predictable. Whereas real people, like mature people, courageous people, resilient people, we don't mind change. We don't mind reforms or revolutions in understanding, revolutions in science and medicine, for example, or even a geopolitical structure. We understand that the world actually does change, sometimes very dramatically, sometimes very suddenly, and we don't expect to live in a world where everything is predictable and peaceful and routine. So that's the difference between what you might call, a snowflake versus a survivor. And I want you to be a survivor. I want you to be psychologically resilient, ready to face what's coming, and ready to deal with the unpredictability of the psychology of the people around you as their mental models implode. Just imagine the World Trade Center buildings in their minds just collapsing all of a sudden because they've been assaulted by new information or new ideas. And that's a pretty good description of what they will be going through. Mass panic, disbelief. What are the 7 stages of, is it 7 stages? I don't know. But the first stage is disbelief or denial, right? Like, oh, this isn't happening. This can't be happening. The dollar can't be crashing, or Bitcoin can't be crashing, or the central banks can't be collapsing, whatever. It's denial. And then eventually, I think, what are the stages? Like bargaining, and then eventually there's acceptance, or there's anger and bargaining and acceptance. I don't remember the whole deal, but they're going to go through all those phases. So you should be ready for it, because a lot of that's you're going to get swept up into it, whether you like it or not. Stay tuned at naturalnews.com for more daily articles. And of course, listen to my podcasts at healthrangerreport.com. Also check out my online store, healthrangerstore.com. Over 600 lab-validated, clean, green products for daily living. Check it out at healthrangerstore.com. Thank you for listening.
Learn more at healthrangerreport.com.